Hello, my friend. Welcome. And thank you for being here. Tonight, I invite you to step back, thousands of years, into a world of sand, stone, and secrets. We've all heard about the marvels of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the pharaohs, the mummies wrapped in gold. But have you ever wondered, what was served at their tables? What did the living dine on before they died? And more chilling, what food was left behind for the dead to feast upon for eternity? You see, the menu of ancient Egypt was far from simple. It was sacred, symbolic, sometimes horrifying. They didn't just eat to survive, they ate to worship, to summon, to control the unseen. So close your eyes, and picture this. A long stone table inside a temple, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps. Priests in leopard skins chant sacred words. On golden platters lie roasted birds, still with heads intact. Bowls of blood-colored wine glisten. There are candied locusts, fermented fish guts, bread shaped like gods, and at the head of the table sits a figure wrapped in linen, unmoving, silent. Dead. This isn't fantasy. This was dinner in ancient Egypt. And tonight, we begin our journey into their forgotten kitchens, into their rituals, their recipes, and their darkest dining traditions. Are you ready? Then come with me to uncover the horrifying menu of the ancient world. Our journey begins not in a temple or tomb, but at the dinner table. Not yours. Theirs. Imagine. The sun is setting over the Nile. The light bleeds gold across mud brick walls. In a villa lined with papyrus mats and alabaster jars, servants shuffle quickly. Bronze trays rattle. Oil lamps are lit. Tonight, a nobleman of high standing is hosting a feast. The guests arrive in linen robes, perfumed and powdered. They recline on low couches, because the elite didn't sit. No, they lounged. Music drifts through the air from flutes and lyres. The smell of roasting meat lingers, rich and spiced. Then the food begins to arrive. First, bread. Not just any bread. Soft loaves baked with honey and dates, shaped like animals or gods. It smells sweet, but dense, almost sour. There is something gritty in every bite. The flour, ground between heavy stones, still carries traces of sand and quartz. Over time, eating it would file down teeth to yellow nubs. It didn't matter. This was the food of wealth. Then come the meats. Goose, duck, quail, plucked and roasted whole. Fish from the Nile, split open and stuffed with herbs. Oxen hearts, liver of gazelle, kidneys of lamb. All served in ornate bowls, some still steaming. Some strangely cold. Wine flows freely. Not just red or white, there are infusions, pomegranate wine, date wine. And the darkest of all, a sacred brew fermented with herbs used only in temples. It is thick, bitter, intoxicating. Some say it was mixed with animal blood during rituals. Others whisper that it held stronger ingredients, opium, or worse. This is no ordinary banquet. Every dish means something. A roast duck could be an offering to the god Horus. A lotus root salad, a symbol of rebirth. Even dessert is sacred. Honey cakes shaped like scarabs, glazed figs arranged like eyes of Ra. But for every dish served, there is something unsettling. Under the table, bones are hidden. Chicken bones, pig bones. Human bones? No one speaks of it. But everyone knows. Sacrifice and food were never far apart. And not everyone eats the same. Outside, beyond the walls, the poor sit on dirt floors and eat what's left. Barley porridge, dried onions, salted fish if they're lucky. They drink beer brewed thick and cloudy, more like gruel than drink. For them, bread isn't shaped like gods. It's barely bread at all. In ancient Egypt, food was power, and that power left a trail of bones. Some buried deep, some dried and salted, some never meant to be found again, but we will find them, because this is only the beginning. Next, we enter the temple kitchens, where organs were prepared not for healing, but for sacrifice. The real menu is only just unfolding. People often say the ancient Egyptians lived on bread and beer, and in a way they did. But that simple sentence hides a deeper, stranger truth. Their bread was not like ours, their beer was not like ours, and their meals, especially for the poor, were not a matter of joy, but of survival. Let's start at the bottom. A farmer wakes before sunrise. He washes in the Nile. His home is made of mud brick. Inside, his wife crushes barley with a stone. The sound echoes through the tiny room, grinding, scraping, always the same. She bakes flatbread over a fire of dried dung, no oil, no spice, just flour, water, and the constant dust in the air. This is breakfast. If he's lucky, there's a bit of onion, maybe a few beans. Meat? Rare. Only on holy days, and even then, scraps. The rest of the time he eats porridge, leeks, lentils, and the same rough bread, day after day. And the beer? Thick, warm, sour. It's made from half-fermented bread soaked in water, flavored with dates if possible. It fills the belly more than it quenches thirst, but it's safer than water. The Nile, though sacred, was no pure stream. It carried disease, crocodiles, and death. Still, even this poor man is lucky. Slaves, yes, Egypt had them, often ate, the worst of all, spoiled grains, animal hide boiled until soft, or broth made from blood and bone, not to nourish, but to keep working. And yet, the food of the poor was not meaningless. Every bite still connected them to the gods. Bread was not just bread. It was life. Beer was a gift from Hathor, the goddess of joy and drunkenness. Even onions were sacred, believed to ward off evil. Eating was not pleasure. It was ritual. But step into the middle class. Scribes, artisans, priests, and things change. Scribes had access to better grains, even spices like coriander and cumin. They could afford honey to sweeten their meals, or fish dried in salt and stored for months. A priest might eat goose liver, dates soaked in wine, even small cuts of mutton from temple offerings. But these foods weren't just richer. They were riskier. Spoilage was common. There were no fridges, no ice. Fish could rot in the sun within hours. Meat could sour by dusk. Still they ate, trusting in prayers, incense, and sometimes superstition. Now let's climb higher, into the homes of the elite. For them, the day began with fruit, figs, pomegranates, maybe even imported nuts from Syria. They had access to saffron, cinnamon, sesame oil. They chewed lotus petals to perfume their breath. They drank wine with breakfast. Lunch might include roasted duck with garlic, lentil stew with chopped dates, or a salad of papyrus stalks and herbs. But dinner, that was the show. Even outside the feasts, the elite ate like kings, because many were. Their kitchens were staffed with dozens. Their storage jars overflowed. They had meats dried like jerky, fish sealed in honey, even cheese wrapped in palm leaves. Some dishes were spicy, others fermented. Some were raw, marinated in lemon and salt for hours. They weren't just surviving, they were indulging. But indulgence comes with a price. Many mummies of the elite show signs of terrible health. Abscessed teeth, gout, bloated livers, even parasites from raw fish. The poor were hungry, but often lean and strong. The rich were full, but sometimes poisoned by their own privilege. And still, every meal, every dish, every drink held meaning. Bread represented resurrection. Beer represented divine joy. Meat was an offering and a reward. Salt was sacred. Honey was a symbol of eternity. They didn't eat randomly. They ate to honor, to balance, to survive both physically and spiritually. But here's the most curious part. No matter how rich or poor, every Egyptian prepared food for the dead. In every home, no matter how small, there was a space for offering. Bread, beer, sometimes onions or flowers. These weren't leftovers. They were gifts. The living fed the dead every day, believing that without nourishment, the spirits would grow angry. And when the spirits grew angry, sickness came, storms came, crops failed, children died. So even the hungriest would leave out a bit of food, and in tombs, especially the royal ones, the menus were eternal, painted on walls, carved into stone, written in spells, food lists stretching across death-like bridges, lists of 40 loaves, 100 jars of beer, 17 ducks, 3 oxen, 8 baskets of fruit. Whether or not they were real didn't matter. The dead would receive them in the afterlife, and priests would bring real food anyway. Fresh bread, slaughtered animals, wine, placed at the mouth of the tomb, left for the gods, or maybe taken for themselves. Because in a land where food was power and offerings never stopped, even the dead had to be fed. And so, bread and beer. They were more than just food. They were the fabric of life, the taste of faith, the echo of eternity. But that fabric would soon twist, because not all meals were blessed. Some were cursed, some were poisoned, and some were never meant for the living at all. In the next part of our journey, we'll open a chamber rarely spoken of, a kitchen not for the living, but for the gods, a place where meat was offered, blood was spilled, and organs were cooked. Not for flavor, but for power. We'll step into the temples and see what happens. Not all food in ancient Egypt was meant to be eaten for pleasure. Some was never meant to be eaten at all. Some dishes were made to speak to the gods, and some to manipulate the hearts of men. Let me take you to a place few ever entered. The Ziu, inner chamber of a temple. It smells of incense, blood, and burning fat. The walls are darkened by centuries of smoke. This is the temple kitchen. But unlike the homes of nobles or the huts of farmers, food here is not cooked to nourish. It's not served with music or laughter. Here, every cut, every spice, every flame is part of a sacred formula, an offering, a command, a spell. On a stone slab lies the carcass of a freshly slaughtered bull. Its blood is still warm. A priest, bare-chested, chants in a whisper. He reaches inside the animal and with practiced hands removes its liver, lungs, and heart. These are not discarded. These are the sacred parts. The liver is placed in a bronze dish, sprinkled with frankincense, and burned. Why the liver? Because the Egyptians believed it held a being's essence, its ka, its soul force. To burn the liver was to release its energy, to feed it directly to the gods. The lungs are boiled in salted water and served with coriander. Not to eat, but to breathe. Yes, breathe. Priests waved the steam towards sacred statues, believing the gods could inhale it. A divine inhalation, an invisible communion. And the heart? Ah, the heart was everything. In death, it was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. If it was heavy with sin, you were devoured by a demon. If it was light, you lived forever. But in life, hearts could be influenced, and this is where love's spells begin. In a small corner of the kitchen, a priestess, trained not in scripture but in sorcery, grinds herbs and animal fat into a thick black paste. She whispers a name. She adds the shavings of a dried ox heart wrapped in linen. She binds it with honey and wine, then places it under the bed of a man she desires. The heart of the bull. To win the heart of a man. It was said the gods themselves fell to these spells. That Isis used food and magic to resurrect Osiris. That desire could be stirred through taste alone. Not all rituals were this subtle. In some temples, a daily offering was made by slicing open a live animal and removing its organs before it died. The pain, the fear, was part of the power. The more intense the moment, the stronger the offering. Meat, lungs, hearts, all were burned. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was done without meaning. And outside the temple, these ideas bled into everyday life. In markets, you could buy dried animal hearts for protection, lungs soaked in vinegar to treat, breathlessness, liver paste to cure night terrors. The boundary between food and medicine was thin. The boundary between food and magic, almost invisible, even in love. One ancient scroll, worn with time, contains a recipe. Crush the heart of a goose. Mix with wine, cinnamon, and honey. Speak the name of the one you desire. Place it in his drink. He will love only you. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe the belief alone was enough. Because to the Egyptians, belief was power, and food was one of its strongest vessels. But behind every offering, every sacred organ, there was something darker, a hidden truth. The gods were never full. They always wanted more, and sometimes that hunger reached beyond animals. In the next chapter, we'll follow the trail deeper, into tombs, into silence, into rituals so secret, even the pharaohs whispered about them. Because what happens when the one being prepared for the feast isn't an animal at all? When we think of meals, we think of warmth, of voices, of living breath. But in ancient Egypt, some of the most important meals were held in silence, with the dead. Let me take you there. It is night. The stars are watching. A small group walks through the desert, past the edge of the village, carrying baskets of food, jars of beer, clay dishes still warm from the fire. They say nothing. They do not laugh. This is not a feast. This is a visit to the tomb. The dead are never truly gone in Egypt. Their names are still spoken. Their homes, those great stone tombs, are still kept. But most important of all, their bellies must still be filled. Once a month, sometimes more, families would return to the tomb of their ancestors. They would kneel at the entrance, whisper prayers and unpack their offerings. Bread, onions, fish, beer. Sometimes dates if the harvest had been good. Meat if they could afford it. Everything was arranged carefully, in the correct order. The dead had favorite dishes, favorite smells, and they remembered. To feed the dead was not a custom. It was a duty, because if the dead grew hungry, they grew restless. They might rise in dreams, in fevers, in sickness, in drought. You see, ancient Egyptians believed that the dead still needed nourishment, but not physical food. They needed the ka, the spirit of the food, its essence. And so, by placing a dish beside the tomb and speaking the name of the one it was meant for, you didn't just remember them. You fed them. But what happened to the physical food? That depends. Sometimes the living ate it after the ritual, believing it had been blessed by the gods. Other times, it was left to decay, to return to the earth. And sometimes, priests or tomb keepers would quietly collect it, storing the best cuts for themselves. In the great necropolises, where thousands of tombs lined the desert like teeth in a skull, entire kitchens were built just for the dead. Large stone ovens, vats for beer brewing, basins for cleaning meats. These kitchens never served the living, and the menus were as long as they were strange. One scroll found near Saqqara lists a funerary meal for a noblewoman. 40 loaves of white bread, 20 of barley, 3 jars of beer, 1 roasted ox, 2 ducks, lentil stew, 4 jars of incense, papyrus salad, fresh figs, honey cake, and 1 small bowl of human hair. Yes, hair. Why? Because it was hers. In some rituals, parts of the deceased's body were symbolically fed back to their spirit, to complete the cycle, to ensure that no part of the soul was forgotten. In other cases, mourners would add hair, blood, or tears to the offerings, so that their grief would become part of the feast. But these were just the surface rituals. Deeper, darker ceremonies took place beneath the tombs. In hidden rooms, priests of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, performed secret rites. They would cook meat, not for the dead to eat, but to mask the smell of decay. As they removed the organs, washed the bones, dried the skin with natron, incense and roasted lamb filled the air, a sacred distraction. But some say the food was more than cover. Some say it was part of the transformation. One ancient tale speaks of the meal of crossing, a dish prepared during mummification, made of goose liver, bread soaked in lotus wine, and pounded myrrh. It was never eaten. It was placed in the dead's mouth before burial, not for sustenance, but for memory. They believed that in the afterlife, the soul would taste this meal again, and remember who it was. That meal would be the first flavor of eternity. But what if the food wasn't just symbolic? What if the living once ate with the dead? There are carvings that suggest just that. Paintings in the tomb of Rekhmir, a vizier of Pharaoh Thutmose III, show a great banquet. Guests recline, eat, and drink wine. Musicians play. But beside them, painted in lighter color, are the dead, transparent, smiling, present, not as ghosts, but as honored guests. This wasn't fantasy, it was belief. To eat beside a mummy was to invite its wisdom. In some rural areas, families kept the mummified remains of loved ones in a sealed chamber within the home. On holy days, they would open the door, light incense, and bring food. Children would sing, elders would pour beer onto the earth. It wasn't morbid, it was memory. But memory fades, and fear grows. Over time, some began to believe that if the wrong food was given, the dead would become angry. That sour beer could wake a bitter spirit. That stale bread might bring misfortune. And so began the art of funerary cookbooks. Yes, real scrolls, with recipes. Dozens of them have been found, sealed in jars, placed in tombs. Recipes for the afterlife. Instructions for eternal feasts. 1. Reads, "Let the bread be made with finest white flour, sifted 5 times. Let it rise under the light of Ra. Let it bake with honey, fig, and tears. Let the name of the deceased be sung with each kneading." The dead did not eat like the living. They dined by magic, and sometimes their meals required sacrifice. There are rumors, never confirmed, but never quite denied, that in the oldest days, in the tombs of forgotten kings, slaves were buried alive, that their bodies were considered part of the offering, that in death, the pharaoh, would dine not just with them, but on their spirits, that human souls became meat on divine menus. Gruesome? Yes. But to the ancient mind, death was not an end. It was a transition, and food was the rope that tied one life to the next. To eat with the dead was to honor them. To feed them was to remember. To forget to feed them was to risk being forgotten yourself. So the next time you light a candle for someone passed, or leave a dish out during a holiday, know that somewhere thousands of years ago someone else did the same. In the dark, by the tomb, holding a loaf of bread in one hand and a jar of beer in the other, speaking softly, feeding the dead. In the mysterious world of ancient Egypt, food was never just food. It was a symbol, a prayer, a spell. Yet, hidden beneath the familiar loaves of bread and jugs of beer, there lay a darker, forbidden side of the Egyptian diet, a side woven with blood, poison, and the relentless thirst for power. To truly understand this secret menu, we must step away from the bustling markets and grand feasts of the pharaohs, and venture deep into the shadows of temple chambers and royal courts. This is where the most dangerous recipes were crafted, where food became a weapon, and magic mingled with medicine in terrifying ways. Blood was considered the purest essence of life. Animal blood was often used in religious rituals, sprinkled on altars, or mixed into potions believed to connect the mortal world to the divine. But it was human blood that carried the most potent power, and that power was coveted and feared. Pharaohs and high priests believed that consuming blood could grant strength, courage, and protection. In certain sacred ceremonies, drinking the blood of a sacrificed bull was said to transfer the animal's power to the ruler. But this was only the beginning. Some texts hint at more sinister uses. Secret mixtures brewed with the blood of enemies, or slaves, used to curse rivals or secure victory in battles both political and spiritual. Then there was poison, nature's dark gift. The fertile lands around the Nile nurtured plants of extraordinary variety. Among them were deadly herbs and roots whose names inspired fear and reverence. The henbane, the nightshade, the aconite, all featured prominently in the shadowy corners of Egyptian pharmacopoeia. These poisons were both feared and harnessed. They served as tools of assassination, cloaked in secrecy and whispered rumors. A drop of poisoned wine, a bite of bread laced with a toxin, a meal served with a side of death. These were the silent weapons wielded by those hungry for power. But poison also had its place in healing. The ancient Egyptians were masterful in their knowledge of plants and substances. They understood that the difference between a remedy and a poison often lay in the dose. The same deadly herb that could kill might also cure. They used these potent plants to treat ailments, perform spiritual cleansing, and protect against evil spirits. Food, then, became the battleground between life and death. The same dish might be blessed to heal or cursed to harm. The rulers of Egypt wielded this power with calculated precision. Their banquets were not only displays of wealth but demonstrations of control. Guests would eat lavish meals, but many feared that even a single bite might seal their fate. The mixing of blood into food and drink was part of secret rituals meant to bind allies and intimidate foes. Drinking the blood of a sacrificed animal was believed to transfer its divine power to the consumer, a practice reserved for the elite. Conversely, food could be used to poison and eliminate enemies quietly, without the clatter of swords or the risk of open conflict. In matters of the heart, forbidden ingredients played a seductive role. Love potions crafted from poisonous plants and animal blood were employed to ensnare and control. A tiny amount slipped into a lover's drink could spark obsession or madness. These dark spells mingled culinary art with magic, blurring the lines between desire and danger. Revenge found expression in food as well. Loaves baked with the ashes of enemies, stews simmered with toxic herbs, and drinks infused with venom were tools of personal vengeance and political intrigue. Consuming such cursed meals was believed to condemn the victim not only to death, but to eternal torment in the afterlife. Yet the boundary between poison and cure remained fragile. Egyptian healers harnessed the same toxic plants to prepare medicines, protective charms, and spiritual cleansings. Priests crafted intricate remedies combining venom and herbs to combat diseases thought to be inflicted by malevolent spirits. Behind every forbidden ingredient was a delicate dance between respect for life and the assertion of power. The gods were watching, demanding sacrifice and obedience. Food was their language, a language that could heal, bless, curse, or kill. This secret menu, hidden behind temple walls and palace doors, told the story of power and fear. It was a world where blood nourished not just bodies, but spirits, where poison carried the promise of both death and healing, and where every bite could be a prayer or a curse. Understanding this dark culinary history reveals the complexity of ancient Egypt, a civilization where food was never just sustenance but a tool of magic, medicine, and power. Imagine a banquet fit for a god-king, the air thick with incense, and the soft murmur of priests and servants. Rich fabrics rustle, golden goblets clink, and the scent of rare spices swirls through the grand halls of a pharaoh's palace. Here, in the heart of ancient Egypt's royal courts, food was more than nourishment. It was a statement of power, wealth, and divine favor. The pharaoh's table was a stage where luxury and the bizarre met, where every dish was crafted to awe guests and honor the gods. The menus read like a dream: exotic meats, delicate pastries, sweet wines, and mysterious ingredients whispered only in sacred texts. Among the most prized royal delicacies was the fowl, geese and ducks, specially fattened in elaborate ponds and fed the finest grains. Roasted until golden, their rich flavor was said to please the gods and satisfy the pharaoh's powerful appetite. Alongside these, freshly caught fish from the Nile, often stuffed with herbs and baked in mud ovens, delighted the court. But beyond these familiar dishes, the pharaoh's kitchen held secrets, bizarre and sometimes unsettling foods that set the king apart from his subjects. One such delicacy was the lotus seed pudding. The lotus flower, sacred to Egypt, symbolized creation and rebirth. The seeds were carefully harvested and cooked into a sweet paste, often mixed with honey and dates. The pudding was served during religious festivals, believed to bestow longevity and divine wisdom upon those who ate it. Then there were the stuffed dormice, small rodents bred in captivity, their meat considered a rare luxury. Stuffed with herbs, nuts, and honey, these morsels were a delicacy of the elite, symbolizing wealth and indulgence. The pharaoh's banquets also featured the enigmatic bread of the gods, large loaves made with multiple grains, including barley, emmer wheat, and even wild grasses. Baked to perfection, these breads were often infused with exotic spices like cumin, coriander, and caraway, which were not common in everyday cooking. The texture was dense but flavorful, meant to sustain the divine rulers through long ceremonies. Sweet treats held a special place on the royal table. Dates, figs, and pomegranates were abundant, but their presentation elevated them to a sacred status. Fruits were sometimes glazed with honey, shaped into intricate designs, or served with thick, creamy cheese made from the milk of goats or cows, specially raised for the palace. Among the most mysterious royal foods was garum, a pungent fish sauce, made from fermented fish entrails. This condiment, prized for its intense umami flavor, was imported or produced in special palace kitchens. Its strong aroma might repel commoners, but to the pharaoh's guests, it was the ultimate seasoning. No feast would be complete without beverages worthy of the gods. Pharaohs favored strong, sweet wines imported from the Levant, alongside local beer brewed from barley and flavored with herbs. The wine was poured from elaborate jars, sometimes gilded or encrusted with precious stones, a testament to the pharaoh's wealth and divine right to rule. Yet, even amidst luxury, the royal kitchen had its dark side. Some dishes featured ingredients that shocked or repelled common folk, like the salted and spiced fish eggs, which were considered a delicacy but smelled so strongly that only the bravest dared to eat them. Others included roasted insects and larvae believed to have medicinal properties or to symbolize fertility and rebirth. Perhaps the most forbidden royal foods were those tied to religious rituals and taboo. Certain meats, like that of the hippopotamus or crocodile, were consumed only by priests and the pharaoh, as these animals were sacred to specific gods. Eating them was both a privilege and a heavy spiritual responsibility, for it was believed the consumer absorbed the creature's divine powers. Royal banquets were not just meals, they were performances of divine connection, political power, and mystical knowledge. The pharaoh, seated at the center, was both host and deity. Guests knew that every bite taken in the presence of the king was an act of allegiance and reverence. And what of the servants and cooks behind these extravagant feasts? They were skilled artisans, often trained in secret recipes passed down through generations. Their knowledge included how to prepare the rarest ingredients, how to balance flavors that dazzled and astonished, and how to weave subtle magical elements into the food. But the question lingers, how much of this food was truly about taste and nutrition, and how much was about power? In ancient Egypt, eating was an act of worship and politics. The royal table symbolized the pharaoh's absolute control, not only over people and land, but over life, death, and the divine order. In the next part, we will explore the foods and feasts of the common people, how ordinary Egyptians lived, ate, and celebrated their own simpler yet fascinating diets. Because even beneath the grandeur of the palace, the story of while pharaohs feasted on exotic delicacies and mysterious ingredients, the vast majority of ancient Egyptians lived a life centered around simple, hearty meals. The common people's diet was shaped by the land, the seasons, and the rhythms of the Nile. Their food was humble but vital, a source of energy for farmers, builders, and artisans who kept the kingdom alive. At the heart of the daily diet was bread. Bread was the staple of life in ancient Egypt, eaten by rich and poor alike. Unlike the rich pharaoh's breads that might include rare spices or multiple grains, common bread was typically made from barley or emmer wheat, coarsely ground and mixed with water to form a dense dough. The bread was then baked on flat stones, or in simple clay ovens. Bread came in many shapes and sizes, from large loaves used for family meals to small round rolls that could be carried into the fields. Sometimes the dough was flavored with herbs or sweetened with dates. Bread was often broken into pieces and dipped into stews or sauces, making it a versatile component of the meal. Speaking of stews, these were another essential part of the common diet. Stews were usually made from lentils, beans, or chickpeas, combined with vegetables like onions, leeks, garlic, and sometimes wild greens. Meat was rare for most Egyptians, as livestock was expensive and reserved mainly for religious offerings, or the wealthy. When meat was consumed, it was often from domesticated animals such as ducks, geese, or small cattle, and only on special occasions. Fish from the Nile was more commonly eaten, either dried, salted, or freshly caught. Fishermen and their families relied on this resource heavily, as fish provided valuable protein. Vegetables and fruits played a significant role in everyday meals. Onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, and radishes were grown in small household gardens or gathered from wild plants. Dates and figs, abundant in the region, were enjoyed fresh or dried as sweet snacks. Beer was the drink of choice for common Egyptians. It was brewed daily in most households and varied in strength and flavor. Unlike the refined, flavored wines of the elite, beer was thick, cloudy, and nourishing, often eaten with a straw to avoid the sediment. It was more than just a beverage. It was a source of calories and nutrition, sometimes even used as payment for labor. Meals were usually eaten in a communal setting. Families gathered around a low table or mat, sharing food and drink. The atmosphere was informal but lively, with stories, songs, and the sounds of children playing nearby. Despite the simplicity, food held deep cultural and religious significance for the common people. Meals were often accompanied by prayers or blessings, asking the gods to ensure the fertility of the land and the health of the family. Festivals brought moments of indulgence, with larger portions of meat and sweeter treats like honey cakes, or pastries made from wheat. But life was not always easy. Times of famine or political unrest could mean scarce food and hunger. Archaeological evidence shows that during difficult periods, people resorted to eating less desirable animals, or even grass and roots to survive. Still, the resilience of the Egyptian people shone through their food traditions. They found joy and meaning in the daily ritual of preparing and sharing meals, no matter how modest. So, while the pharaoh's tables dazzled with luxury and mystery, the everyday table tells the story of a society rooted in the land, connected to the Nile, and sustained by simple but essential. To truly appreciate the food of ancient Egypt, we must explore not just what they ate, but how they prepared it. Behind every loaf of bread, every stew, and every delicate pastry lay a set of skilled cooking techniques honed over centuries. These methods reflected the natural resources, climate, and cultural beliefs of the civilization along the Nile. Grains and milling bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet, but it began long before baking, in the grinding of grain. Ancient Egyptians cultivated two main grains, emmer wheat and barley. These grains were harvested from the fertile floodplains of the Nile and dried under the hot sun. Milling was a labor-intensive process. Farmers and workers used large stone querns to grind grain into coarse flour. Two circular stones, one atop the other, rotated to crush the kernels. This flour was often gritty and full of husks, unlike the refined flours we use today, but it was perfect for making dense, nutritious bread. Baking bread, once milled. The flour was mixed with water and sometimes yeast or sourdough starter to create dough. The Egyptians understood fermentation, allowing the dough to rise slightly, giving the bread a lighter texture. Various shapes were molded by hand or with wooden molds, and bread could be sweetened with dates or flavored with herbs. Ovens were usually simple clay or mud constructions heated by wood or charcoal fires. Flat stones were used as baking surfaces. Bread was baked in batches, with women often overseeing the process. Baking bread was a communal affair, sometimes accompanied by singing and storytelling. Brewing beer was brewed at home and on a larger scale for festivals. The process began with malting barley, soaking it in water to sprout, then drying it. The malted grain was then ground and mixed with water to create a mash. This mash was left to ferment naturally, with wild yeasts turning sugars into alcohol. Often, the beer was thick and cloudy, with a sour taste. Herbs and spices were sometimes added for flavor or medicinal benefits. Brewing was both a practical and social activity, with large jars used to store beer, and drinking usually involved straws to filter sediment. Cooking meat and fish meat was scarce for the majority but prized by the wealthy. It was prepared in various ways: roasting, boiling, or drying. Roasting was done over open fires or in clay ovens, often on spits to ensure even cooking. Fish from the Nile was a common source of protein. It could be grilled, boiled, salted, or sun-dried to preserve it. Salted fish was especially important for storage and trade. Some fish, like the catfish, were avoided due to religious beliefs, while others were delicacies. Vegetables and legumes. Vegetables, like onions, leeks, garlic, cucumbers, and lettuce, were boiled or cooked in stews. Legumes such as lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans were staple protein sources for common people. These were often slow-cooked to soften and combined with herbs and spices. Olive oil and animal fats were used sparingly for flavor and moisture. Use of herbs and spices. Ancient Egyptian cuisine included a variety of herbs and spices, many of which had medicinal or religious significance. Coriander, cumin, dill, fennel, and thyme were common. These were either grown locally or imported from neighboring regions. Salt was highly valued, not only for taste but also for preserving food. Honey, too, was used extensively as a natural sweetener and preservative. Dairy and cheese milk from cows, goats, and sheep was consumed fresh, or used to make cheese and butter. Cheese was often soft and fresh, sometimes curdled using natural acids or enzymes. Dairy products were a luxury for many, but they played important roles in both daily diets and ritual offerings. Cooking tools and utensils. The Egyptians used a variety of cooking vessels made from clay, stone, and metal. Pots and bowls were shaped to withstand heat and were sometimes decorated with religious symbols. Knives, grinding stones, wooden spoons, and strainers were common. Cooking was primarily done over open fires or in enclosed ovens, with careful control of heat. Preservation techniques. Given Egypt's hot climate, food preservation was crucial. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting were widely practiced. Fish and meat were salted and dried to last through seasons of scarcity. Grains and dried legumes were stored in clay jars sealed with wax or resin to keep out moisture and pests. Rituals in food preparation. Food preparation was often intertwined with religion. Before cooking, prayers and blessings were offered to the gods to ensure success and safety. Certain foods were prepared only on specific days or for particular rituals, underlining the sacred nature of food. Cooking and food preparation in ancient Egypt was an art that combined practicality with spirituality. The skills passed down through generations created a rich culinary tradition that nourished not just the body, but also the spirit. In ancient Egypt, food was never simply about sustenance. It was deeply intertwined with religion, spirituality, and the cycles of nature. Every meal, every offering, carried symbolic meaning and was an act of devotion to the gods. To understand the culture of ancient Egypt, we must explore how food functioned in religious rituals and grand festivals that shaped their society. The Egyptians believed that the gods controlled every aspect of life: the flooding of the Nile, the growth of crops, health, and prosperity. Thus, food was seen as a sacred gift from the divine, and sharing it with the gods was both a duty and a privilege. Offerings to the gods' temples across Egypt were centers of religious life, where priests prepared daily offerings of food to appease the gods. These offerings included bread, beer, fruits, vegetables, and meats, arranged meticulously on altars. The act of offering food was a form of communication, a way to honor the gods and ensure their favor. Some temples had vast granaries and livestock farms dedicated to sustaining these rituals. The quality and variety of the offerings reflected the importance of the deity and the wealth of the temple. Food offerings were not just symbolic. They were believed to transform into the spiritual essence of the gods. Priests would later consume the remains, sharing in the divine blessing. This sacred cycle reinforced the connection between the mortal and the divine. Feasting and festivals. Ancient Egypt's calendar was marked by numerous religious festivals, many of which centered around food. These events were times of celebration, community, and renewal, blending the sacred and the social. One of the most important festivals was the Opet festival, honoring the god Amun. During Opet, temples would prepare lavish feasts, and statues of gods were carried in grand processions. Food was distributed to priests, nobility, and the people, symbolizing the god's generosity and the renewal of the king's divine power. The Waf festival, celebrated every few years, also featured enormous banquets and offerings. Large quantities of meat, bread, beer, and wine were prepared. The entire community would participate, sharing in the abundance blessed by the gods. At harvest festivals, farmers brought their best crops to the temples, offering the first fruits to deities such as Osiris, the god of agriculture and rebirth. These offerings were essential for ensuring future fertility of the land. Sacred foods and taboos. Certain foods were considered sacred and reserved exclusively for religious ceremonies or the priestly class. For example, the meat of the bull was linked to the god Apis and consumed only during special rituals. Conversely, some foods were taboo for specific groups or during particular times. For instance, fish from certain Nile species were forbidden for priests because they were associated with evil spirits or impurity. The concept of purity governed what could be eaten and by whom. Priests followed strict dietary rules, avoiding foods that might defile them. This separation underscored their unique spiritual role as intermediaries between gods and people. Food as symbolism. Food was also powerful symbolism in funerary practices. Tombs were stocked with images and models of food to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. Egyptians believed that the spirit needed nourishment beyond death. The famous funerary banquets were held to honor the dead, with offerings of bread, beer, meat, and fruit placed on altars within tomb chapels. These rituals ensured the deceased's safe passage and eternal sustenance. Food shaped stories and myths as well. The myth of Osiris, for example, linked the cycles of growth, death, and rebirth with agricultural bounty and the sharing of food. Community and social cohesion. Religious feasts served not only spiritual purposes, but also reinforced social bonds. During festivals, people from all walks of life gathered to share meals, reinforcing loyalty to the king and the gods. Food was a unifying force, a reminder of shared identity and mutual dependence. It bridged social divides, allowing even the poorest to partake in the blessings of the gods, at least symbolically. Thus, in ancient Egypt, food was a sacred language, spoken in temples and homes, in grand festivals and quiet offerings. It was the thread connecting the mortal world to the divine, life to death, and people to each other. While grand feasts and temple offerings showcased the opulence and spirituality of ancient Egyptian food culture, everyday life for most Egyptians played out in bustling marketplaces and along busy streets filled with tempting smells and lively sounds. The street food scene was vibrant, colorful, and an essential part of urban life. In towns and cities like Thebes, Memphis, and Amarna, markets were not just places to buy goods. They were social hubs where people gathered to exchange news, barter, and enjoy quick, affordable meals. Marketplaces, the heart of commerce and food. Culture markets were held daily or on special market days, often near temples or central squares. Here, vendors displayed fresh produce, fruits, vegetables, grains, as well as dried fish, salted meats, and freshly baked bread. The variety depended on the season and region, but staples like onions, garlic, leeks, dates, figs, and cucumbers were common sights. Spices and herbs were sold by specialized traders, their pungent aromas adding flair to the marketplace. Artisans and cooks set up stalls offering ready-to-eat foods, catering to workers, travelers, and locals alike. Popular street foods. Among the favorite street snacks were small flatbreads topped with onions or herbs, sold fresh and warm. These could be eaten on the go or dipped into thick lentil stews. Another common treat was dried fish, often salted and sun-dried to preserve it. These were cheap, flavorful protein sources, sometimes grilled on the spot for customers. Stewed legumes, like fava beans or lentils, were served in clay bowls, often with a splash of oil or vinegar. Vendors prepared these hearty dishes in large pots over open fires, filling the streets with mouth-watering scents. For something sweet, vendors offered dates stuffed with nuts or honey-coated figs, perfect for a quick energy boost. Beverages on the go. Beer was the quintessential street drink. Sold in jugs or bowls, beer vendors catered to laborers and travelers needing refreshment after a long day. The beer was thick, slightly sour, and often drunk through straws to avoid sediment. Water was also sold, but beer was favored because it was safer to drink and more nutritious. Eating etiquette and social dynamic. Street food culture was informal and communal. People often gathered around shared tables or benches, chatting and watching the bustling market life. Food was eaten with hands, bread serving as the main utensil for scooping and dipping. Markets were melting pots of social classes. While the poor and middle classes dominated the scene, wealthier individuals sometimes mingled, enjoying simple street food away from the confines of the palace. Food vendors and their lives. Many street food vendors were women, known for their cooking skills and entrepreneurial spirit. They often prepared food from family recipes passed down through generations. These vendors had to be resourceful, using seasonal ingredients, minimizing waste, and attracting customers with flavorful dishes and friendly service. Seasonal and festival food markets. During religious festivals or harvest time, markets expanded dramatically. Special foods appeared. Freshly baked honey cakes, spiced meat pies, and brightly colored fruit preserves. These occasions turned markets into lively celebrations, reflecting the close ties between food, religion, and community life. The vibrant, street food culture of ancient Egypt reveals a lively, connected society, where food was not only a necessity, but a source of joy and interaction. It was here, in the lively streets and markets, that everyday Egyptians experienced the tastes, and, in the heart of ancient Egyptian culture, the banquet was far more than a mere meal. It was a lavish, elaborate event that blended the art of food with music, dance, and spiritual celebration. A moment where social status, religious devotion, and pure joy came together in a magnificent display. The significance of banquets were typically hosted by wealthy nobles, high-ranking officials, or even the pharaoh himself. These gatherings were occasions for celebration, marking victories, religious festivals, weddings, or funerary commemorations. They showcased the host's generosity, wealth, and connection to the gods. Food at banquets was abundant and diverse, intended to impress guests and honor divine beings. The ancient Egyptians believed that by sharing such a feast, they partook in cosmic harmony and the blessings of the gods. Setting the scene, banquets took place in specially prepared halls or open courtyards adorned with decorations. Walls were painted with scenes of feasting, music, and dancing. Tables were low and wide, often covered with fine linens and set with ceramic bowls, cups, and plates. Guests reclined on couches or cushions, dining in a relaxed, intimate atmosphere. Servants attended to every need, ensuring that food and drink flowed freely. The feast. A symphony of flavors. The menu at a banquet was a dazzling array of flavors and textures. Freshly baked breads, some sweetened with honey or dates, were served, alongside a variety of stews rich with lentils, beans, onions, and herbs. Meats were centerpieces: roasted ducks, geese, and even wild game like antelope or gazelle. Fish from the Nile, sometimes smoked or grilled, added delicate flavors. Exotic spices imported from distant lands elevated dishes, while sweet honey cakes and fruit preserves provided dessert. Wine and beer banquets featured both wine and beer, the drinks of gods and kings. Wine was considered a luxury, often reserved for the elite, enjoyed in small quantities and flavored with spices or herbs. Beer, on the other hand, was consumed in generous amounts, thick and nourishing. Drinking was an event in itself, with toasts and songs praising the host, the gods, and life itself. Music and dance. No banquet was complete without music and dance. Musicians played harps, lutes, flutes, and percussion instruments, creating a lively, rhythmic backdrop. Dancers, both men and women, performed graceful and energetic routines, entertaining guests and enhancing the celebratory mood. Songs praised. The pharaoh celebrated love or told stories of gods and heroes. Music was a spiritual experience, believed to connect the physical world to the divine. Games and entertainment. Alongside eating and music, banquets often featured games and contests. Guests might engage in board games like senet, a popular pastime thought to have religious significance. Storytelling and poetry recitals added to the cultural richness, allowing guests to engage intellectually and socially. The role of women played vital roles in banquets as hostesses, entertainers, and participants. Noblewomen sometimes led rituals or offered prayers during the feast. Professional singers and dancers were highly regarded for their skills, and their performances were essential to the event's success. Religious dimensions banquets were not only social events but religious ceremonies. Often held in honor of specific gods or ancestors, they included offerings and prayers. Food shared at these events was believed to carry divine energy, blessing all present and maintaining cosmic balance. The aftermath. Once the feast concluded, leftovers were carefully stored or distributed among servants and the poor, reflecting the importance of charity. Banquets reinforced social hierarchies but also fostered community and spiritual connection, weaving together the fabric of ancient Egyptian society. The ancient Egyptian banquet was a grand celebration of life's pleasures, a ritual blending nourishment, art, and faith. Through these gatherings, Egyptians expressed their deepest values: honor, generosity, and reverence for the divine. In a land ruled by the mighty Nile, where the sun blazed fiercely across golden sands, the ability to preserve and store food was not merely a convenience. It was a necessity. Ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated techniques to ensure their food would last through harsh dry seasons, periods of famine, or times when the river's bounty was scarce. These preservation methods reflect a deep understanding of natural processes, resourcefulness, and a culture that valued food not only as sustenance, but also as a sacred gift. The importance of food. Preservation. The annual flooding of the Nile brought fertility and abundance, but also unpredictability. Floods could fail, crops could be damaged by pests, and drought could threaten the food supply. For a civilization so dependent on agriculture, preserving food was critical for survival. It also supported trade, allowed for religious offerings to be stored safely, and helped maintain social stability. Preserving food extended its shelf life, making it available during off-seasons and for long journeys. This was particularly important for staples like grains, legumes, fish, and meat. Grain. Storage grains such as emmer wheat and barley formed the backbone of the Egyptian diet. After harvest, grains had to be kept dry and safe from pests like insects and rodents. The Egyptians stored grain in large ceramic jars or mud brick silos with tight-fitting lids. These containers were often sealed with wax or resin to prevent moisture and insects from entering. Granaries were important architectural structures, sometimes attached to temples or palaces, where officials oversaw the storage and distribution of grain. Archaeological evidence shows granaries designed with ventilation to keep grain dry and protected. Grain was often stored in bulk, and during famines or economic hardship, it became a form of currency or payment. Drying and salting drying was one of the oldest and most effective methods for preserving food. The hot Egyptian sun was an ally in this process. Fish and meat were cleaned, sliced, and laid out on racks or mats to dry thoroughly. This removed moisture that bacteria and fungi needed to grow. Salt, a valuable commodity, was used extensively for curing meat and fish. The Egyptians harvested salt from natural deposits or from evaporated seawater. Salted fish and meat could be stored for months, making them available year-round. These preserved foods were essential for long journeys, military campaigns, and religious offerings. Fermentation was a natural preservation method used notably in brewing beer and making sourdough bread. The Egyptians understood that fermentation not only extended shelf life, but also enhanced flavor and nutritional value. Beer was brewed daily in most households. It was stored in large clay jars, often sealed to control fermentation. The thick, cloudy beer was nutritious and safe to drink in a time when clean water was scarce. Fermented foods and drinks were believed to have medicinal and spiritual properties, linking them to health and divine favor. Use of honey and oils. Honey played a crucial role in preservation. Its natural antibacterial properties allowed it to be used as a sweetener and preservative. Egyptians stored honey in sealed jars, sometimes mixing it with fruits or nuts for longer-lasting treats. Oils, particularly olive and castor oils, were used to coat foods, creating barriers against moisture and air. Honey-coated fruits and nut pastes could last longer than fresh produce, offering sweet indulgences during times when fresh food was scarce. Clay jars and sealing techniques. Pottery was central to storage and preservation. Egyptians crafted a variety of jars and containers in different sizes, shapes, and with tight lids. Sealing methods involved wax, resin, or cloth soaked in oils. These seals protected contents from pests and spoilage. Some jars were buried underground to keep contents cool, leveraging the Earth's natural insulation. Cold storage and refrigeration. Although refrigeration as we know it did not exist, Egyptians used natural methods to keep food cool. Cold cellars, shaded storerooms, and underground pits maintained lower temperatures, slowing spoilage. Evaporative cooling techniques, such as wet cloth coverings, were sometimes used to protect perishable foods. Food storage in tombs. Preserving food was so important that tombs were stocked with food models and sometimes real, preserved items to provide for the deceased in the afterlife. These preserved goods symbolized eternal nourishment and reflected beliefs in life beyond death. Challenges and innovations. Despite these advanced methods, food spoilage was always a risk. Ancient Egyptians continuously adapted and refined their preservation techniques. They developed methods to detect spoilage and combined preservation with careful preparation to maximize shelf life. The legacy of ancient Egyptian preservation. Of these ancient techniques influenced later civilizations. The emphasis on drying, salting, fermentation, and storage resonates through history and into modern food science. Their resourcefulness ensured that food remained a blessing, sustaining a civilization that thrived for millennia. Understanding how ancient Egyptians preserved and stored their food gives us insight into their daily lives, their challenges, and their ingenuity. It reveals a culture deeply connected to the land, the river, and the cycles of nature, where every grain, fish, and loaf was valued and protected. When we think of ancient Egyptian cuisine, two staples immediately come to mind: bread and beer. These humble yet essential foods were the backbone of the Egyptian diet, but their importance extended far beyond mere nutrition. Bread and beer were deeply woven into the social fabric, religious practices, and economy of ancient Egypt. making them key to understanding the culture as a whole. Bread. The staff of life bread was the primary source of calories for Egyptians across all social classes. Made mainly from emmer wheat or barley, bread came in countless forms, from simple flatbreads baked on hot stones to elaborate loaves shaped like animals or decorated for religious offerings. The process of bread making was both a craft and a ritual. Women usually prepared dough at home, grinding grain on stone mills, mixing with water and natural yeasts, then baking it in clay ovens or on flat griddles. The aroma of fresh bread was a constant in Egyptian households. Bread's significance was symbolized by its presence in tomb paintings, temple reliefs, and funerary offerings, ensuring the deceased would never go hungry in the afterlife. Beer. The ancient elixir beer was the everyday drink of Egyptians, from laborers working the fields to royalty in the palaces. Made from fermented barley or emmer, beer was nutritious, providing calories, vitamins, and hydration in a climate where water purity was a concern. Unlike modern clear beers, ancient Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and often flavored with dates, or herbs. It was consumed through straws to avoid sediment and was often thick enough to eat with a spoon. Beer was brewed at home or in specialized breweries and was an important commodity traded and taxed by the state. Social and economic importance. Bread and beer were sometimes used as currency or payment for laborers, including the workers who built the pyramids. Rations of bread and beer were distributed regularly to workers as part of their wages. Markets and street vendors sold a variety of bread types and beer flavors, making these staples accessible to all Egyptians. Religious and ritual significance. Bread and beer had profound religious symbolism. They were among the most common offerings to gods in temples and to the dead in tombs. Certain breads were baked specifically for rituals, sometimes shaped or inscribed with hieroglyphs. Beer was offered during festivals honoring deities like Osiris and Hathor. Priests consumed special types of bread and beer during ceremonies, believed to grant divine favor. Bread and beer in festivals. During major festivals, enormous quantities of bread and beer were produced and distributed. For example, at the Opet festival, special loaves and barrels of beer were offered to gods and shared with participants. These communal meals reinforced social bonds and collective worship. Production techniques and innovation. The Egyptians developed sophisticated methods to improve the quality and variety of bread and beer. They used natural yeasts and fermentation to leaven bread, creating light and airy textures. Brewing involved multiple fermentation stages and flavoring agents to produce different beer types. Health and nutrition. Bread and beer provided essential nutrients, particularly carbohydrates and B vitamins. Beer's fermentation process also helped preserve grains and made nutrients more bioavailable. In a time before refrigeration, the consumption of beer was safer than water and contributed to public health. Bread and beer in art and literature. Depictions of bread and beer appear in tomb paintings, papyri, and literary texts, emphasizing their central role in daily and spiritual life. Poems and songs celebrated these staples as gifts from the gods. Bread and beer were far more than food and drink. They were cultural pillars of ancient Egypt, sustaining life, symbolizing prosperity. Ancient Egyptian cuisine, while rich and diverse, also included some ingredients and dishes that might surprise, or even shock, modern palates. The ancient Egyptians utilized everything the Nile and surrounding deserts had to offer, sometimes turning to unusual or unexpected foods to survive, celebrate, or perform rituals. In this part, we dive deep into the more kin huang, shocking or terrifying aspects of their menu. Foods that might sound strange today but were perfectly normal in their time. Unusual meats and animal parts. While we often hear about roasted ducks or fish from the Nile, ancient Egyptians also consumed meats that might seem strange now. Crocodile meat was eaten, especially by those living near the Nile. Crocodiles were sometimes hunted or captured, and their meat prepared with spices and herbs. This was considered a delicacy, but also linked to religious symbolism, as crocodiles were sacred animals associated with the god Sobek. Hippopotamus meat was consumed on rare occasions. The hippo was a dangerous animal, but its meat was prized for its richness. Eating hippo meat might have also held spiritual significance, as hippos symbolized chaos and power. Various birds, such as quails, pigeons, and even ostriches were part of the diet, but also some more unexpected ones like ibises or herons, which are now protected species. Offal and organ meats, liver, intestines, brains, were not wasted. They were considered nutritious and used in various recipes, much like many traditional cultures around the world. Insects and small creatures. Insects were not commonly documented, but evidence suggests Egyptians may have eaten locusts and other insects, especially during famines. Locusts are rich in protein and were sometimes roasted or ground into flour. While this may seem alarming today, entomophagy, eating insects, has a long history globally, including in ancient Egypt. Fish from the Nile. Delicious, but sometimes dangerous. The Nile was a source of many fish species, some of which could be toxic if not prepared correctly. Catfish and Nile perch were popular, but required careful cleaning to avoid parasites. Some fish with sharp spines or poisonous parts were avoided or processed with particular methods. Exotic. Plants and herbs. Ancient Egyptian cuisine included various wild herbs and plants, some with potent flavors or effects. Mandrake root, used medicinally and sometimes in food, was known for its narcotic properties. Garlic and onions were staples, but also had believed magical properties, warding off evil. Bitter herbs were eaten during religious festivals, symbolizing hardship and purification. Fermented and preserved. Foods fermentation created foods that might seem strange to modern tastes. Fermented fish sauces, similar to modern Southeast Asian fish sauces, were used as condiments. Pickled vegetables and salted meats had strong, pungent flavors. Bread and cakes with surprising ingredients. While most breads were simple, some special. Cakes included unusual additives. Honey mixed with spices and nuts created dense, sticky sweets. Some cakes contained seeds, or even small amounts of animal fat to enhance texture. Uncommon cooking techniques. Cooking methods sometimes involved burying food underground or using heated stones to cook. Smoked meats and fish were common preservation methods, adding smoky flavors that might be intense for modern eaters. Religious and magical foods. Some foods were reserved for rituals or magical purposes. For example, certain breads and drinks were charged with spells or prayers before consumption. Foods like garlic were thought to protect against evil spirits. Conclusion. A menu that reflects life, survival, and belief. The ancient Egyptian diet was shaped by geography, religion, and culture, resulting in a menu that could be surprisingly kin huang from a modern viewpoint, but made perfect sense in its time. Their resourcefulness, respect for all living things, and deep spiritual beliefs meant that nothing was wasted or overlooked. By exploring these unusual foods and ingredients, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of a civilization that thrived for thousands of years along the Nile. To truly understand the culinary world of ancient Egypt, we must look beyond the ingredients and dishes themselves and explore the daily routines, social customs, and cultural meanings surrounding food. Food was a vital thread woven into the fabric of Egyptian life, influencing family dynamics, social interactions, and even political power. Daily meals, structure and timing. The typical ancient Egyptian's day was structured around work, prayer, and communal eating. Most Egyptians ate 2 to 3 meals a day, although this varied by social class, occupation, and season. Breakfast. shemayet. Usually simple and quick, breakfast might include leftover bread, onions, dates, or a small bowl of beer. Farmers and laborers often began their day early with a modest meal to sustain them through hard physical work. Main meal, mesket. This midday or early afternoon meal was the largest and most important. It typically featured bread, stews, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. This was a time for families to gather and share, reflecting community bonds. Evening meal, neshmet. Usually lighter, this meal might consist of bread and some fruits, or leftover stew. In wealthier households, it could be more elaborate, accompanied by beer or wine and music. Eating utensils and table manners. The Egyptians ate mainly with their hands, using pieces of bread as utensils to scoop up food. Forks and knives were rare and mostly used for cooking or butchering. Meals were often served on low tables or trays, and people sat or reclined on mats or cushions. Politeness and hospitality were highly valued. Guests were welcomed warmly, and hosts often offered the best portions. Sharing food was an expression of friendship and respect. Social hierarchy, reflected in food. Food was a marker of social status. The wealthy enjoyed a wider variety of meats, sweets, and imported delicacies, while commoners relied on staples like bread, beer, and vegetables. Feasts and banquets displayed the host's status and generosity. Servants and slaves prepared elaborate meals but rarely ate the same foods. Religious influence on diet. Many Egyptians followed dietary rules influenced by religious beliefs. Certain animals were sacred or taboo, affecting what could be eaten. For example, cows were sacred to Hathor and generally not eaten, while fish and poultry were common. Food was also a medium for religious offerings and rituals, blurring the lines between sustenance and spirituality. Gender roles and food preparation. Women typically managed food preparation in the household, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, and cooking meals. In temples and palaces, professional cooks and bakers, including men and women, produced large quantities of food for ceremonies and officials. Women's role in food preparation was both practical and symbolic, tied to family well-being and religious duties. Street food and markets. Everyday eating out. As we discussed earlier, street vendors sold quick meals and snacks, allowing busy workers and travelers to eat affordably on the go. Markets bustled with activity, offering fresh produce, baked goods, and ready-to-eat items, contributing to the lively social fabric of Egyptian cities. Fasting and food restrictions. Fasting was part of some religious practices, especially for priests during certain festivals or rituals. There were periods when specific foods were avoided to maintain purity or honor the gods. Food in festivals and celebrations. Food played a central role in festivals, where communal feasts, offerings, and special dishes symbolized renewal, gratitude, and divine favor. During harvest festivals, for example, people shared the bounty with neighbors and the poor, reinforcing community ties. Food waste and charity. While waste was minimized, through preservation and resourcefulness, surplus food from feasts was often redistributed to workers or the needy, reflecting social responsibility. Conclusion. Food as a mirror of ancient Egyptian life. Through daily habits, social customs, and religious practices, food in ancient Egypt was more than nutrition. It was a powerful cultural force shaping identity, community, and spirituality. By examining these aspects, we gain a fuller picture of a civilization where every meal told a story, every dish carried meaning, and food connected the earthly and divine worlds. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between food and medicine was often blurred. The ancient Egyptians believed that what you ate not only nourished your body, but could also heal it. Their extensive knowledge of herbs, spices, and natural ingredients made their cuisine a foundation for health and well-being. This part explores how food and medicine intertwined in the daily life of the Egyptians, revealing a fascinating kitchen pharmacy where meals became remedies. Holistic approach to food and health. The Egyptians viewed the body as an interconnected system where balance was essential. Illness was often thought to arise from an imbalance or external evil forces, and food was a primary tool to restore harmony. Many ingredients served dual purposes, as nourishment and as medicines, used in cooking and healing rituals. Common medicinal ingredients in food. Honey. Renowned for its antibacterial and healing properties, honey was used both as a sweetener and a topical treatment for wounds and infections. Its preservative qualities also made it invaluable in food preparation. Garlic and onions. More than flavor enhancers, these alliums were believed to boost immunity and stamina. Workers building the pyramids reportedly ate large amounts of garlic to endure hard labor. Coriander and cumin. These spices were common in cooking and medicine, used to aid digestion and relieve stomach ailments. Fenugreek. Seeds and leaves were incorporated into dishes and remedies to promote lactation and treat inflammation. Mandrake and myrrh. Used cautiously, these powerful plants had medicinal and sometimes magical uses, often included in ritual preparations. Food as preventive medicine. Certain diets were prescribed to prevent illness or strengthen the body. For example, barley soup and bread were considered nutritious and easy to digest, suitable for the sick or elderly. Specific foods were recommended for ailments like digestive problems, respiratory issues, or fatigue. Healing foods and recipes. Papyrus. Medical texts include recipes for poultices, ointments, and medicinal drinks that often combined edible ingredients. A common remedy might involve mixing honey with herbs to soothe sore throats, or applying salted fish paste to wounds. Spiritual and magical dimensions. Food-based healing was intertwined with magic. Priests and healers invoked spells while preparing and administering food remedies. The consumption of sacred foods was believed to channel divine power and protect the body from harm. Brewing as medicine beer was not only a dietary staple, but also considered medicinal. It was believed to aid digestion and provide essential nutrients. Special brews were made with added herbs to treat illnesses. Food in funerary medicine. Food offerings in tombs were intended to provide eternal sustenance and health for the deceased in the afterlife. Some tombs contained remnants of preserved medicinal foods or herbs, underscoring their importance. Legacy and influence. Ancient Egyptian food medicine practices influenced Greek and Roman medicine and continue to inform herbal and nutritional therapies today. Their holistic approach reminds us that food can be a powerful tool for healing, not just survival. Exploring the healing powers of ancient Egyptian cuisine gives us insight into their sophisticated understanding of health and nutrition. Food was never just food for the ancient Egyptians. Beyond sustenance, it was a profound element in their religious life, a way to communicate with the gods, celebrate divine events, and maintain cosmic order. In this part, we explore the dual practices of feasting and fasting, the sacred ceremonies around food, and how these rituals shaped Egyptian spirituality. The sacred role of feasting was central to Egyptian religious festivals and communal gatherings. These events were occasions to honor gods, celebrate seasonal cycles, or mark important political and social milestones. Temples held large feasts where priests and devotees consumed specially prepared foods, believed to be imbued with divine power. For ordinary people, public festivals offered a rare chance to enjoy abundance and share in the sacred joy of communal eating. Types of feasts. Harvest festivals celebrated the bounty of the Nile and land, often with bread, beer, roasted meats, and sweet cakes. The Opet festival in Thebes was a major event with elaborate feasting. Funerary feasts. Food offerings at tombs ensured the deceased's soul was nourished in the afterlife. Relatives gathered to eat together, reinforcing family bonds and respect for ancestors. Temple feasts. Priests offered food to gods, then consumed the sanctified portions, believed to confer blessings and protection. Food offerings and sacred meals. Food offerings included bread shaped with hieroglyphs, cakes, fruits, vegetables, and meat. Each item carried symbolic meaning, and the preparation was meticulous to honor the gods properly. Offerings were presented daily in temples, but especially during festivals. The ritual feeding of the gods was thought to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic balance of the universe. Fasting is spiritual discipline. Fasting was practiced by priests and some worshippers as a means of purification, self-control, and spiritual focus. Before performing rituals, priests might abstain from certain foods or fast entirely to maintain ritual purity. Fasting was also linked to mourning practices, where abstaining from food symbolized grief and respect for the dead. Restrictions and food taboos. Certain foods were forbidden or restricted during religious observances. For example, eating pork was generally avoided as pigs were seen as unclean. Temples sometimes had their own dietary rules for priests and attendants. Ritual meals and sacred foods. Some foods were considered sacred and reserved for religious use, such as special types of bread, wine, and beer brewed with specific rituals. These foods were thought to be transformed by the god's presence during ceremonies. Communal sharing and social cohesion. Feasting fostered social unity, breaking down barriers between classes and bringing people together in celebration. Public meals at festivals allowed the poor to partake in what might otherwise be inaccessible delicacies. Mythology and food. Many myths involve food, such as the story of Osiris's death and resurrection, where bread and beer play roles in the rituals commemorating him. Food symbolized life, death, and rebirth, a continuous cycle reflected in Egyptian belief systems. Symbolism in food shapes. An ingredient's food was often shaped or decorated to represent divine symbols or animals. For example, bread shaped like animals was not only nourishing but also a symbolic gift to the gods. Legacy of religious food practices. These ancient rituals influenced later religious traditions and provide insight into the Egyptian worldview, where the sacred and mundane were deeply intertwined. Understanding the rituals of feasting and fasting opens a window into the spiritual heartbeat of ancient Egypt, showing how food nourished not only the body, but all. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Egyptian cuisine was not just what they ate, but how they managed to keep their food safe, edible, and tasty in a challenging environment. With a hot climate, limited refrigeration, and seasonal harvests, Egyptians developed ingenious food preservation and storage methods that allowed them to survive and thrive for millennia. This part explores these methods in detail, revealing the sophisticated science and practical wisdom behind Egypt's kitchen technology. Challenges of food preservation. The arid Egyptian climate posed risks such as spoilage, pests, and dehydration. Ensuring food availability year-round required strategies to prevent decay and waste. Flood cycles of the Nile dictated agricultural production and storage needs. The Egyptians needed to store surplus grain, meat, and produce safely for lean months. Grain. Storage. The foundation of food. Security. Grain was the cornerstone of the Egyptian diet, especially emmer wheat and barley used for bread and beer. Large silos and granaries, sometimes made of mud bricks or stone, were built to store harvested grain. These structures were designed to protect against moisture, rodents, and insects. Grain was often cleaned, dried, and sorted before storage to extend shelf life. Drying and dehydration. Drying was a common preservation method, especially for fish, meat, fruits, and herbs. Fish were salted and then sun-dried or smoked, producing products that could last for months. Meats were often salted and air-dried, sometimes combined with smoking to add flavor and prevent spoilage. Fruits like figs and dates were dried in the sun, concentrating sugars and preserving sweetness. Salting and brining salt was a valuable resource, used extensively for preserving meat and fish. Brining, soaking food in salt water, helped inhibit bacterial growth. Salted foods were stored in sealed containers to maintain their condition. Fermentation, a natural preservation. Fermentation wasn't just for beer and bread. It was used to preserve vegetables and create flavorful condiments. Fermented fish sauces were prized for adding umami and extending shelf life. Sealed containers and storage vessels, pottery jars, amphorae, and baskets lined with resins or wax were common for storing grains, oils, and liquids. Sealing containers helped keep out air and pests. Clay pots were also used to store water and beer, cooling contents through evaporation. Cold storage and evaporative cooling. Although no refrigeration existed, Egyptians used clever methods to keep food cool. Underground storage pits and cellars took advantage of cooler temperatures below ground. Evaporative cooling jars absorbed heat and kept water and perishables relatively fresh. Preserving dairy and eggs. Milk was consumed fresh but also processed into cheese or yogurt-like products, which lasted longer. Eggs were sometimes coated with mud or ash to delay spoilage. Transport and trade preservation. Preserved foods could be transported across regions, facilitating trade and royal banquets. Dried fruits, salted fish, and cured meats were common trade items. Religious and funerary preservation. Some preserved foods were included in tombs as eternal sustenance. The care taken in preserving offerings reflects their spiritual importance. Impact on daily life and economy. Efficient preservation reduced waste, stabilized food supply, and supported population growth. It allowed the Egyptian civilization to flourish despite environmental challenges. Understanding these preservation and storage techniques shows how the Egyptians combined observation, experimentation, and tradition to solve fundamental survival problems. Skills that still resonate in ancient Egypt. Beer and wine were much more than just beverages. They were integral to daily life, religious ceremonies, social rituals, and even the economy. This part delves into how these fermented drinks shaped Egyptian culture, symbolized status, and served both practical and spiritual purposes. Beer. The everyday staple beer was the most common drink for people of all classes. Made primarily from barley and emmer wheat, it was nutritious, mildly alcoholic, and often safer to drink than water due to the fermentation process. Workers, farmers, and laborers relied on beer for energy and hydration, often receiving it as part of their daily rations. Production. Methods. Brewing beer was mostly done by women in households, as well as in large-scale temple breweries. The process involved fermenting a dough-like mixture of grain and water, producing a thick, porridge-like beverage. Various flavorings like dates, herbs, and spices were added to create different beer varieties. Wine. A symbol of status. Wine, primarily made from grapes grown in the Nile Delta and imported from surrounding regions, was considered a luxury. It was favored by the elite and royalty, and featured prominently in banquets and religious offerings. Wine was stored in beautifully decorated jars and sometimes flavored with herbs. Religious significance. Both beer and wine were used in rituals, offerings to gods, and temple ceremonies. Beer was associated with the goddess Hathor, who was also linked to music and joy. Wine was used in libations and funerary rites, symbolizing life and rebirth. Social and cultural functions. Drinking beer. and wine was a communal activity that fostered social bonds. Festivals and feasts featured these drinks, accompanied by music, dancing, and poetry. Economic importance: beer and wine production supported many workers, from farmers and brewers to merchants and transporters. Trade in these beverages connected Egypt with neighboring lands. Health and nutrition. Besides pleasure, beer provided calories, vitamins, and minerals, important in the diet of ancient Egyptians. Moderate consumption was considered healthy, while overindulgence was discouraged. Legends and myth stories like the destruction of mankind myth involve beer as a magical tool. The goddess Sekhmet's rage was quelled by beer dyed red to look like blood, showing the symbolic power of the drink. Legacy. The brewing traditions of ancient Egypt influenced Mediterranean cultures and remain a fascinating chapter in the history of fermentation. Through beer and wine, ancient Egyptians expressed identity, religion, and community, making these drinks. Welcome back, dear listener, to the next chapter in our journey through the terrifying, tantalizing, and utterly fascinating culinary world of ancient Egypt. If the farmers and laborers of the Nile Delta survived on bread, onions, and beer, then what of the pharaohs? What of the priests, the high nobles, and the courtiers cloaked in linen and gold? What did they eat? And more intriguingly, what did they dare to eat that others could only dream of? In this part, we lift the gilded curtain and step into the lavish banquet halls of the elite, where food wasn't just sustenance, it was a performance of power, exclusivity, and the divine right to indulge. The culinary divide. Commoner versus royal. To understand elite cuisine in ancient Egypt, we first need to understand the massive food gap that existed between social classes. While the majority of the population survived on grains, legumes, and a few modest vegetables, the upper echelons of society had access to imported spices, rare meats, and foods from across Egypt's vast empire. Food was a marker of rank, not just in what you ate, but in how it was prepared, served, and even who was allowed to witness you eating it. Exotic meats: flamingos, hippos, and gazelles. Among the most startling items on the royal menu were meats that most Egyptians would never see in their lifetime. Flamingo tongues, prized for their rarity and tenderness, were considered a delicacy of the elite. These were slow-roasted or sometimes served raw with wine and herbs. Hippopotamus meat, dangerous to procure and difficult to prepare, was occasionally eaten by royal hunters and their households. It was believed to confer strength and courage. Gazelle and antelope, hunted in the deserts and preserved by salting or drying, were delicacies reserved for grand feasts. Their lean meat, when spiced with imported coriander and garlic, was said to melt in the mouth. Fish fit for the gods and pharaohs. Fish in Egypt was both a blessing and a paradox. In some religious contexts, it was taboo, particularly for the priestly class. Yet certain species were considered elite delicacies. Nile perch and catfish, slow-smoked over acacia wood, were served at banquets in luxurious sauces made of honey, mustard seed, and fermented fish brine. Fish was sometimes wrapped in lotus leaves, stuffed with wild herbs, and steamed in ceramic pots, a primitive but highly effective method that locked in flavor. Sacred birds and forbidden feasts. The ibis, sacred to the god Thoth, and the heron, linked to solar deities, were often not consumed by the general public due to religious reverence. However, mummified remains and ceremonial records suggest that in rare ritual feasts, priests and pharaohs may have eaten small portions of these birds in symbolic acts, believed to ingest the god's wisdom and power. Another shocking dish? Crocodile meat. Though feared and often worshipped, especially in Sobek's temples, croc flesh may have been eaten by bold royals during victory feasts or exotic festivals. Roasted with honey, and acacia syrup. The sweet life, desserts of the eye, divine. If meat was rare, then sugar was a miracle. Egyptians didn't have cane sugar, but they had dates, figs, carob, honey, and grape molasses, which they turned into incredibly rich and complex desserts. Honey-roasted tiger nuts, yes, actual nuts from sedge plants, were ground and pressed into sticky balls with dates, the ancient equivalent of energy bites or truffles. Stuffed dates with crushed almonds and herbs were coated in sesame and saffron, a spice imported from the East and worth its weight in gold. Fritters made from papyrus flour, deep-fried and glazed with honey wine, were offered to gods and pharaohs alike during the Festival of the Valley. Imported wonders, cinnamon, frankincense, and mystery fruits. As Egypt's trade networks expanded during the New Kingdom, exotic ingredients began to arrive from the Levant, Nubia, and the mysterious land of Punt. Cinnamon and myrrh, often burned in temples, were also used to flavor wine and meat dishes for royal banquets. Frankincense, though primarily used in incense, was infused into oils for cooking elite breads. Egyptian records mention mysterious fruits, possibly bananas, coconuts, or even mangoes, presented as tribute to pharaohs, though scholars still debate what exactly was eaten and what was symbolic. Ritual and restriction. Eating like a god food wasn't only a pleasure, it was a spiritual act. For the royal class, especially the pharaoh who was considered a god on earth, food consumption followed cosmic order. Specific foods were eaten during solar festivals, fertility rituals, or to prepare for the afterlife. Some foods were forbidden outside of ritual contexts, like certain divine breads made with blue lotus or charred bone ash, meant only for temple priests or divine kings. The performance of power in elite Egyptian society. Meals were public. Spectacles. Lavish banquets would feature dozens of courses, dancers, harpists, and perfumed oils poured between dishes. Servants presented dishes in gold or faience bowls, carved with hieroglyphs. Meals might begin with sacred blessings and end with storytelling, or poetry. Even the presentation of bones and leftovers mattered. They were buried ceremonially or offered to minor gods. Preserving the privilege, even after death in tombs, the food of the elite was replicated endlessly. Walls depict idealized feasts with platters of roast duck, baskets of bread, rows of fruit, and jars of beer and wine. Tombs of queens and nobles included real preserved food offerings, dried meats, honey cakes, and sealed amphorae of wine meant to last eternity. Some tombs even contained full kitchens, with tools and clay ovens ready for the afterlife. Final thought for this chapter. The food of Egypt's elite wasn't just a matter of privilege. It was a spiritual, political, and cultural declaration. In every bite, from roast flamingo to saffron-glazed nuts, the elite declared their mastery over the land, the cosmos, and the people who served them. They ate to live, yes, but they also ate to rule. Today, we enter the realm of death, but not in fear. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end. It was a transition, a gateway to eternity. And food? Food was the bridge between the world of the living and the afterlife. In this part, we explore the rituals, beliefs, and deeply symbolic meals that accompanied the dead on their eternal journey. Death as a journey, and food as the fuel. The Egyptians believed the soul, or Ka, needed sustenance after death. Just like the body, it grew weak if not fed. So, meals weren't just left for memory or symbolism, they were essential. Tombs were often stocked with food, both real and symbolic, to nourish the Ka. Families of the deceased continued to bring food offerings to tombs on sacred days, festivals, and anniversaries. Certain meals were believed to activate the soul, allowing it to walk, speak, and pass into the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. The funeral feast, a sacred banquet after mummification and religious rites, a funeral feast, was held. This was not just a gathering to mourn, it was a ritual to transfer vitality from the living to the dead. The funeral meal included sacred breads, roast meats, especially goose, duck, or ox, wine, figs, and dates. Portions of the meal were consumed by the living, while other parts were burned, buried, or placed inside the tomb. Eating during the funeral was believed to commune with the dead, reinforcing the bond between generations. The menu of the afterlife. Egyptian texts like the Book of the Dead. The afterlife is portrayed as a place of abundance and harvest, where the righteous could plow fields, fish from the Nile, and enjoy eternal feasts. To prepare for this, tombs often included models of bakers, brewers, butchers, and even miniature kitchens. Wall paintings depict banquets with tables loaded with food, loaves, joints of meat, baskets of fruit, and amphorae of beer and wine. Special food spells were inscribed on tomb walls, designed to magically replenish the food offerings forever. Offerings to the dead, rituals of sustenance. A core element of mortuary practice was the daily or seasonal offering of food to the deceased. Priests, family members, or hired caretakers would bring trays of food to the tomb's offering table. Common offerings included bread and beer, as the base, oxen and fowl, symbolic meat, lettuce, onions, and garlic, purifying vegetables, milk, honey, and cakes, sweet offerings for rebirth. Each offering was accompanied by ritual words, breathing life into the gift. Without the spoken ritual, the food was spiritually inert. Strange and symbolic foods, some items found in tombs might surprise you, even unsettle you. Mummified joints of meat, wrapped and preserved just like the body. Loaves shaped like animals, intended to serve as both food and magical protection. Dried locusts and snails, possibly symbolic of endurance, used in elite tombs. In some royal tombs, exotic spices, wine, and even salted fish were buried in painted jars, each labeled with origin and date. Ancient inventory lists for eternity. Food and mummification, the ritual of feeding the dead. Interestingly, food also played a role in the mummification and burial process itself. During the opening of the mouth ceremony, one of the most important death rituals, priests used sacred tools to touch the mummy's mouth so that the soul could eat and speak in the afterlife. Sometimes pieces of bread, wine, or milk were physically placed near or even inside the mouth of the mummy. Oils and perfumes used in embalming were often infused with edible herbs like thyme, cinnamon, and coriander, blending the boundary between food and ritual. The eternal banquet, kings and the gods for the pharaohs, who were considered gods on earth. Their tomb banquets were modeled after divine feasts. In the tomb of Ramses III, banquet scenes show not only food, but servants, musicians, dancers, and divine guests. The concept of Heka, or magical power, meant that food was not only to be eaten, but also used to maintain cosmic balance. Some pharaohs even demanded offerings in temples long after death, expecting their ka to continue receiving royal meals daily, funded by the state. The economics of feeding. The dead feeding the dead wasn't just religious, it was logistically intense and economically costly. Wealthy families created endowments, land or assets, whose profits funded regular food offerings to tombs. Temples employed entire staffs of bakers, brewers, butchers, and priests, just to prepare daily meals for the gods and the royal dead. In some cases, offerings were outsourced. Symbolic models were placed in the tomb to replace physical offerings that families couldn't maintain. The decline and legacy over centuries. Especially in the later periods of Egyptian history, some food rituals became more symbolic than literal. Tombs began to include painted or carved representations of food instead of the real thing. Greco-Roman influence changed funeral meals, adding wine-heavy libations, pomegranate dishes, and imported foods. Yet even through change, the central idea remained. To eat was to remember, to offer food was to honor, and to feed the dead was to keep them alive in spirit. Hello, dear listener, and perhaps, just this once, let me begin, not just with a greeting, but with gratitude. Thank you for staying with me, for following each step through sand, flame, shadow, and spice, for walking side by side with the ghosts of bakers, brewers, butchers, and priests through 21 long chapters of discovery. And now we arrive at our final destination, the last course, the final offering. This is where the feast ends, but first, a story. It is just before sunrise in Thebes. The sky is still soft with stars, and the wind carries the scent of the river. Along the dusty road leading toward the necropolis, a man walks quietly. In his hands, he carries a simple basket, a round loaf of barley bread, 2 dried dates, and a small clay jug of beer. He is not rich, not a priest, just a son. He stops at his father's tomb, a structure of limestone and sun-faded paint. He kneels, places the food on a stone slab, and speaks softly. Not a prayer, not a chant, but a memory. He always liked his beer strong, he says with a half-smile. And he hated soft bread. Always wanted the crust burnt. He pours a few drops onto the earth. Then he eats the rest. A communion of memory. A meal across time, and, in that small moment, everything we've learned becomes real. Throughout this journey, we've discovered so much more than food. We've uncovered an entire worldview, a way of living and dying, where every meal was a message, every dish a belief, every crumb of bread a bridge between the earthly and the eternal. We saw farmers who harvested grain as if harvesting prayers. We watched temple cooks who stirred pots for gods they'd never see. We heard of kings who feasted not just for pleasure, but for cosmic balance. And we stepped into tombs, where dried meat and wine were sealed away, not to rot, but to wait. Wait for the soul to rise, to eat again, to be whole. Do you remember the first flatbread? Hard and plain, baked on stones, beside the Nile. Do you remember the golden goose, roasted in the palace kitchens? Or the crocodile meat from the southern marshes? Do you remember the honeyed lotus petals, the sweet beer made from fermented dates, the onion stew served to the pyramid builders? Each dish told a story, each bite whispered a name. And each time we returned to the table, we were not just eating with the living. We were sharing with the dead, the gods, the memories passed down in silence. Ancient Egyptian food was never about the food alone. It was about the offering. To eat was to give. To cook was to protect. To serve was to remember. Now, here we are, at the end of the road. The table is empty, the candles burned low. But maybe, just maybe, you'll never look at a loaf of bread quite the same again. Because now you know that even in a land of desert and dust, food could bloom like papyrus. Even, under the gaze of the gods, a humble bowl of lentils could be a sacred act. And even thousands of years later, someone, you, would listen and remember. So, to all the ancient cooks and brewers, to the nameless bakers and butchers, to the priests who blessed offerings, to the farmers who harvested wheat under the blazing sun, to the kings and queens who dined in gold, And to the children who placed a date beside a tomb and whispered, "I remember you." This final offering is for you. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Thank you for listening. Not just with your ears, but with your imagination, your curiosity, and your open heart. May the flavors of ancient Egypt linger in your thoughts, like the warmth of a fire long after it dies. And may you too find your own table, your own ritual, your own way to remember. Goodbye for now. And may your ka never go hungry.